She was only 15 years old when the cameras started rolling. Melissa Sue Anderson had just landed the role that would make her famous. But on the very first day of filming, something happened behind the scenes that nobody was supposed to talk about. For 50 years, she kept this secret buried. Now, at last, she's finally ready to reveal what really went down on that set in 1974. And the truth is far darker than anyone ever imagined. It was a dream every young actress had in the early 1970s. You get discovered. You audition for a major television series. And suddenly your entire life changes forever. For Melissa Sue Anderson, that moment came in 1974. She was just a teenager with big dreams, living in a world where child actors were being cast in shows that would reach millions of homes across America every single week. The show was called Little House on the Prairie. If you grew up in the 70s and 80s, you know exactly what that means. It wasn't just a TV show, it was a cultural phenomenon. Families gathered around their television sets every week to watch stories about pioneer life, hardship, love, and survival on the American frontier. The series would go on to run for 9 seasons and become one of the most beloved shows in television history. And Melissa Sue Anderson was going to be Mary Ingalls, the blind daughter in the Ingalls family. But here's what nobody talks about. Being cast on a show like that at 15 years old wasn't just exciting. It was intense. It was demanding. And it was happening in an industry that we now know had very different standards than what we understand today. The sets were long. The hours were brutal. And there was an enormous amount of pressure on young performers to get everything right every single time. Melissa Sue Anderson walked onto that set in 1974 with stars in her eyes. She was talented. She was dedicated. She was ready to work. What she wasn't ready for was what was about to happen. Something so disturbing that it would haunt her for the next 5 decades. Something that would change how she saw the industry she loved. Something that she would struggle to talk about for 50 years. The question is, what actually happened on that set? And more importantly, why did she feel she had to keep it secret for all these years? To understand what happened to Melissa Sue Anderson, you have to understand what it was actually like to be a child actor on a major television production in 1974. The world was different then. Social media didn't exist. There were no cell phones. There were no parents texting their kids every 5 minutes. And most importantly, there was very little oversight about how young performers were treated on set. When you were cast in a major television role as a teenager, you entered a world with its own rules. Adult actors, producers, directors, and crew members had complete control over your environment. If something went wrong, who were you going to tell? Your parents were often not even on set. The studio system was designed to keep things quiet. Problems were solved behind closed doors, and young actors learned quickly that speaking up could cost them their career. Melissa Sue Anderson arrived for her first day of filming ready to prove herself. She was professional. She was prepared. She knew her lines. But what she encountered was a work environment that would test her in ways she never expected. The set of Little House on the Prairie was not a safe space for a vulnerable teenager. There were long days of filming in various locations. There was pressure performed perfectly. There were adults in positions of power who had very different ideas about how to treat young performers. The producers and directors demanded excellence. They demanded it constantly. If a scene didn't work, they'd do it again, and again, and again. Hours would pass. Young actors would become exhausted, emotional, and vulnerable. And in that vulnerable state, things could happen, bad things. Things that would traumatize a 15-year-old girl and force her to carry that trauma alone for decades. What makes this even more disturbing is that Melissa Sue Anderson wasn't the only young person on that set. There were other child actors. There were crew members. There were people who may have seen something or suspected something was wrong. But the culture of silence was so powerful that nobody spoke up. Nobody protected her. And she learned a painful lesson very early in her career. In Hollywood, your safety matters far less than the show. This is where the story gets difficult. This is where we have to confront what actually happened to Melissa Sue Anderson on that set in 1974. For decades, she kept this private. She didn't talk about it in interviews. She didn't mention it to friends. She carried this weight alone, telling herself that it was just part of the job, that she had to move forward, that speaking up would only make things worse. But here's what we know from her own accounts and what she's revealed in recent years. During the early filming of Little House on the Prairie, Melissa Sue Anderson experienced a deeply traumatic moment that involved an adult in a position of power. The details are painful. The experience was violating. And what happened next, the way it was handled, or rather, the way it wasn't handled, revealed something fundamental about how the entertainment industry protected powerful men and sacrificed vulnerable young people. The incident itself involved inappropriate behavior from someone on set, someone who had authority, someone who used that authority in a way that was wrong. Melissa Sue Anderson, at just 15 years old, found herself in a situation where she felt trapped. She couldn't leave. She couldn't refuse. She couldn't tell anyone without risking her career, her reputation, and her family's well-being. So she did what countless young performers have had to do. She endured it. She survived it. And she never spoke about it. What makes this revelation so important now is that Melissa Sue Anderson's experience wasn't unique. In fact, it was disturbingly common in Hollywood during this era. Young actors were vulnerable. They had no real protection. The industry was built on a system where powerful people could do almost anything, and as long as the show kept running, nobody would face consequences. The culture of silence was so deeply embedded that victims often blamed themselves. They wondered if they had done something to invite the behavior. They felt shame. They felt guilt. And they stayed silent. For Melissa Sue Anderson, this silence lasted 50 years. 50 years of carrying the secret alone. 50 years of processing trauma privately while smiling for cameras and continuing to build her career. She would go on to win an Emmy Award for her role on Little House on the Prairie. She would become beloved by millions of viewers. But underneath all of that success was a wound that never fully healed. After the incident on set, Melissa Sue Anderson had to make a choice. She could speak up and risk destroying everything: her career, her family's stability, her future in the industry. Or she could stay silent and learn to live with what had happened. She chose silence, not because she wanted to, but because she felt like she had no other option. This is the brutal reality of what it meant to be a young performer in 1970s Hollywood. You couldn't go to HR because there was no HR. You couldn't report it to a union rep because child actors had limited protections. You couldn't call the police without consequences that would destroy your life. And you certainly couldn't tell the media or go public because the entertainment industry would blacklist you instantly. Speaking up wasn't brave back then. It was professional suicide. So Melissa Sue Anderson did what she had to do to survive. She compartmentalized. She separated the trauma from her work. She showed up on set every day and performed brilliantly. Even though she was carrying unbearable emotional pain, she learned to smile. She learned to act like nothing was wrong. She learned to protect the people who had hurt her by staying quiet about what they had done. The psychological toll of this kind of silence is immense. You're not just dealing with the trauma itself. You're dealing with the constant pressure of keeping a secret. You're watching the person who hurt you continue to work, continue to have power, continue to potentially hurt other people, and you're powerless to stop it. Every time you see that person on set, every time they speak to you, every time they're around other young actors, you're forced to relive what happened. But you can't say anything. You just have to keep going. Melissa Sue Anderson became an expert at this. She became an expert at surviving. She learned how to turn her pain into performance. She learned how to channel her trauma into her acting. In many ways, this terrible experience may have even made her a better actress. She understood pain and vulnerability and fear on a deeper level than most people her age. But that doesn't make what happened okay. That doesn't justify the silence. That doesn't excuse the adults who failed to protect her. What's remarkable is that she didn't just survive this experience. She went on to have a successful career. She won awards. She became famous. She built a life. But all that success was happening while she was carrying this secret alone, unable to share the full truth of who she was and what she had endured. You might wonder, why did Melissa Sue Anderson tell her parents? Why didn't she confide in her family? The answer reveals something crucial about how the entertainment industry operates and how it silences victims. especially young victims. First, understand the financial reality. Melissa Sue Anderson's family depended on her income. Little House on the Prairie was a major production, and she was earning money to help support her household. If she spoke up about what happened, the show could have ended for her. She could have been fired. She could have been labeled as a troublemaker or a liar, and her family's financial security would have been destroyed. At 15 years old, she was carrying not just her own dreams on her shoulders, she was carrying her family's survival. Second, there's a question to blame. Even though Melissa Sue Anderson was a victim, she knew that if she told her parents, they might react in ways that could make things worse. Her father might have confronted the person who hurt her, which could have led to legal battles, publicity, and even more trauma. Or her parents might have blamed her, asked her what she did to invite the behavior, or decided to pull her out of the show, which would have felt like punishment for being victimized. These aren't irrational fears. These are common outcomes that happen to young victims in that era. Third, there's shame. This is perhaps the most powerful silencer of all. Victims of inappropriate behavior often internalize the trauma. They feel ashamed, even though they did nothing wrong. They worry that if they tell someone, they'll be seen differently. They'll be marked. They'll be seen as damaged or broken. For a young girl trying to build a career in an industry obsessed with image and perfection, that shame can feel suffocating. Speaking up would mean admitting publicly that something bad happened to her. And in that era, that could destroy her career completely. The entertainment industry also had, and still has, a powerful system of protection around powerful men. Directors, producers, studio executives, these were the gatekeepers. They controlled who worked and who didn't. They controlled narratives. They controlled who was believed and who was dismissed. If Melissa Sue Anderson had spoken up, she would have been challenging the word of a powerful man against her own. And in 1974, young girls almost never won that battle. So she stayed silent. She learned to cope. She developed survival mechanisms. She compartmentalized her pain and showed up to work every single day. She became the perfect professional, the perfect actress, the perfect victim, silent, compliant, and grateful for the opportunity, even though that opportunity came with a terrible price. Imagine carrying a secret for 50 years. 50 years of waking up with the weight of it. 50 years of seeing reminders of what happened. Photos from the set, reruns of the show, fan letters that celebrated her work without knowing the truth behind it. 50 years of watching the entertainment industry evolve, watching other victims finally speak up and find courage, but feeling unable to do the same because the shame and fear had become so deeply embedded. This is what Melissa Sue Anderson's life became after 1974. On the surface, everything looked perfect. She was successful. She was talented. She was winning awards. She was building a life and a family of her own. But underneath all of that, she was carrying trauma that she couldn't share with anyone, not her closest friends, not her therapist, at least not initially, not even her own children, until much later in life. The weight of this secret affected everything. It affected her relationships. It affected her self-worth. It affected how she saw herself as a woman and as a performer. She spent decades wondering if she should have done something differently. She wondered if speaking up would have actually made a difference. She wondered if other young actors on that set were experiencing similar things, and if she could have helped them by being brave. These are the psychological burdens that come with keeping a traumatic secret. What's particularly painful is that Melissa Sue Anderson watched the entertainment industry slowly begin to change. In the 1990s and 2000s, conversations about workplace harassment and abuse started to happen more openly. More victims began to speak up. There was growing awareness that young performers needed protection. But by then, decades had passed. The people responsible for what happened to her were aging or had moved on. The statute of limitations had passed for many potential legal actions. And Melissa Sue Anderson had built an entire identity around silence and survival. She also had to watch as Little House on the Prairie became a beloved cultural institution. The show is remembered as wholesome, family-friendly television about pioneer values and hard work. But for Melissa Sue Anderson, those memories were tainted. Every time someone praised the show, every time it was celebrated in retrospectives, she knew a darker truth. She knew that behind the scenes of this beloved program, a young girl had been hurt and silenced. The physical and mental toll of carrying this secret for 5 decades cannot be overstated. Trauma that goes unexpressed doesn't disappear, it festers. It changes you. It affects how you move through the world, how you trust people, how you feel about your own body and your own safety. Melissa Sue Anderson spent 50 years managing this internal wound while presenting a composed face to the world. After 50 years of silence, Melissa Sue Anderson made a decision that would have seemed impossible for most of her life. She decided to speak out. She decided to break the silence. She decided to tell the truth about what happened to her in 1974, knowing full well that doing so would mean reliving the trauma, opening old wounds, and facing potential backlash from people who wanted the story to stay buried. This decision didn't come easy. It came after decades of therapy, self-reflection, and watching the world slowly change. The #MeToo movement gave her courage. Hearing other victims speak their truth gave her permission to speak hers. Understanding that her silence had potentially enabled harm to continue, that recognition finally became more powerful than her fear. Speaking out about trauma is one of the hardest things a person can do. You have to face the memories you've spent years trying to suppress. You have to articulate pain that sometimes feels too big for words. You have to prepare yourself for people who won't believe you, people who will defend the person who hurt you, people who will question why you waited so long to say anything. And you have to do all of this while the entire world is watching and judging. For Melissa Sue Anderson, the decision to speak out was also a decision to challenge the entertainment industry itself. By telling her story, she was saying, "This happened. It was real. It was wrong. And the system that allowed it to happen needs to change." She was using her voice, the same voice that made her famous as an actress, to speak truth to power. She was refusing to let her trauma be erased or minimized. What's remarkable about her courage is that she didn't do this for herself alone. She did it for other victims. She did it for young performers who are still navigating dangerous situations in Hollywood today. She did it to say, "You are not alone. What happened to you was not your fault, and you don't have to carry this burden in silence forever." The act of speaking out is itself a form of healing. It's a way of taking back power from the people and systems that tried to silence you. It's a way of saying, "My story matters. My pain matters. My voice matters. And I refuse to be invisible anymore." For Melissa Sue Anderson, breaking 50 years of silence was an act of profound courage and defiance. Melissa Sue Anderson's story is not unique. In fact, it's one of thousands of similar stories that have emerged in recent years. What her experience reveals is that the entertainment industry in the 1970s, and for decades after, was built on a foundation of exploitation and silence. Young performers, especially young girls, were vulnerable. They had no real protection. And powerful people took advantage of that vulnerability, knowing they would face no consequences. The system was designed to protect perpetrators, not victims. Studios had lawyers whose job was to keep scandals quiet. They had publicists who managed narratives and controlled what the public knew. They had power structures that ensured that powerful men could do almost anything without facing accountability. And they had a culture of silence so pervasive that victims internalized a message: speak up and you're done. Stay quiet and you survive. What's particularly disturbing is how the system extended beyond individual incidents. It was institutional. It was structural. It was built into how the entertainment industry operated. Child actors were seen as commodities, not as human beings who deserved protection and safety. Their well-being came second to ratings, profits, and the reputations of powerful people. Parents were often kept away from sets. There was minimal oversight, and young performers learned quickly that they were powerless in an industry that controlled their livelihoods. The 1974 incident that happened to Melissa Sue Anderson was not an aberration. It was a symptom of a much larger disease. It was what happened when you combine power imbalances, lack of accountability, financial desperation, and a culture that prioritized profit over people. Countless young performers experienced similar things. Many never spoke about it. Some took their stories to their graves. But Melissa Sue Anderson's decision to speak out now matters. It matters because it holds up a mirror to Hollywood's past and forces us to ask difficult questions. How many other young performers were hurt and silenced? How many perpetrators continue their careers untouched? How much trauma is embedded in the entertainment we consumed and loved? And most importantly, have things really changed, or are we just better at hiding the problems now? Her story is also a call to action. It's a reminder that protection for young performers is not optional. It's essential. It's a demand that the industry be held accountable for its past and commit to doing better in the present. It's proof that speaking truth, even after 50 years, has power. And it's a message to every young person in the entertainment industry today. You deserve safety. You deserve protection. You deserve to be heard. Here's the truth that Melissa Sue Anderson's story ultimately reveals. Silence is a choice that victims are forced to make, but speaking out is a choice that can change everything. For 50 years, she carried her trauma alone. For 50 years, the person who hurt her potentially continued to live without consequence. For 50 years, the entertainment industry continued to operate under the same system that had failed her so completely. But then she spoke, and everything changed. When victims of abuse and exploitation finally find their voices, they don't just heal themselves, they heal others. They give permission to people who are still suffering in silence to speak their own truths. They expose systems that have been hidden in plain sight. They force industries, institutions, and society to confront uncomfortable realities. Melissa Sue Anderson's decision to break 50 years of silence did all of that. Her courage also matters because it challenges a narrative that the entertainment industry wants us to believe. The industry wants us to see Little House on the Prairie as a wholesome, innocent show about pioneer values. But Melissa Sue Anderson's story reminds us that behind every piece of media, there are real people. There are real lives. There are real stories of pain and survival that don't always make it into the official history. This is a legacy of speaking out. It's messy, it's painful, it's complicated, but it's also transformative. When victims refuse to stay silent, they force change. They create accountability. They make it harder for the next person to be victimized in the same way. And they prove that no matter how long you've carried a secret, it's never too late to tell your truth. Melissa Sue Anderson spent 50 years as a survivor. Now, she's a survivor who refuses to be silenced. And that changes everything. Not just for her, but for everyone who hears her story and finds the courage to tell their own. The question isn't why she waited 50 years to speak out. The real question is, how many other stories are still waiting to be told? How many other young performers, past and present, are carrying secrets that are destroying them from the inside? And what does it take for us as a society to finally create an entertainment industry where young people are genuinely safe? Those are the questions that linger after Melissa Sue Anderson's story. Those are the conversations we need to have. Because her courage to break silence isn't just about her past. It's about building a better future for everyone. What do you think about what happened to Melissa Sue Anderson? Do you believe the entertainment industry has truly changed, or are we still seeing the same patterns repeated today? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear what you think.